The morning Clara Holt arrived in Dustfield, Nevada, with nothing but a carpet bag, a bruised jaw, and eyes that dared anyone to pity her. Old Pete Granger at the general store gave her 2 weeks before she packed up and left. He was being generous. Most of the town gave her 3 days. It was the spring of 1878, and Dustfield sat in the high desert like a cracked tooth in a dry mouth, stubborn, ugly, and somehow still standing despite every reason it should have fallen. The silver mine 2 miles east had brought men here who were rough at the edges and rougher still at the center, and the town had grown around their appetites. A saloon, a barber, a doctor who drank too much, a church that didn't get enough use, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mabel Trent who kept 3 cats and a shotgun and tolerated no nonsense before 7 in the morning. Clara took the last available room on the upper floor of Mabel's boarding house. She set her bag on the narrow bed, looked at the cracked mirror above the wash basin, and pressed 2 fingers gently against the yellowing bruise along her cheekbone. She did not cry. She had done all the crying she intended to do somewhere back in the desert between here and Reno, and she had decided somewhere along that long and lonesome road that crying would be a luxury she could no longer afford. She was 23 years old and she was starting over, and the town of Dustfield didn't need to know a single thing about where she'd come from. But towns always find out. That is the nature of small places. There is nothing people love more than filling in the blank spaces of a stranger's story, and they rarely fill them in with kindness. By the second evening of her arrival, it was known that she'd come from Reno. By the 3rd day, someone had heard she'd been married. By the end of the 1st week, the story had traveled from Mabel's boarding house to the saloon to the church pew, and it had collected details along the way a river collects mud, until the original truth was buried somewhere underneath, and no one could quite agree on what shape it had taken. What was true? Clara Holt had been married to a man named Douglas Holt, a man of some financial standing in Reno, a man with a temper that worsened considerably when he drank, and a man who had, over the course of 2 years, made her understand in very concrete terms what it meant to belong to someone who did not treat belonging as a gentle thing. She had left with what she could carry. She had not looked back. She intended never to look back. What was also true, she was extraordinary with a needle and thread, having learned from her mother who had learned from her grandmother, and she could sew a dress or mend a saddle or hem a pair of trousers with the kind of quiet precision that made people stop and stare. She had a small amount of money saved enough for perhaps 2 months of rent at Mabel's, and she needed work, which meant she needed to establish herself in Dustfield before the town decided she wasn't worth the bother. She found a small space beside the barber shop that was being used as a storage room and convinced its owner, a taciturn man named Arlo Webb, to rent it to her for a very modest sum. She cleaned it herself. She whitewashed the walls. She brought in a table and 2 chairs and a dressmaker's form she transported carefully in the back of a freight wagon from Reno, and she hung a hand-painted sign in the window that said, "Clara Holt, Fine Sewing and Alterations." The town watched all of this with considerable interest and considerable skepticism. "She'll be gone by June," Pete Granger told anyone who would listen, which was most of the men who came in for tobacco. "Women like that don't stay. They run from one thing and then they run from the next. It's in them. You can see it in her eyes." He said this loudly enough that it eventually made its way back to Clara, as all things said in small towns eventually do. She heard it, pressed her lips together, and went back to hemming a skirt for the preacher's wife, making each stitch perfectly even and perfectly tight, because she had decided that the most eloquent response to people who expected her to fail was simply to stay standing. It was on a Thursday in late April, 2 weeks after her arrival, that she first encountered Eli Calloway. He came into her little shop with a cavalry jacket that needed the sleeve reattached at the shoulder, a clean tear, the kind that happened when something caught on a nail or a fence post and pulled at precisely the wrong angle. He ducked slightly to come through the low doorway, and then stood in the small space looking very large and somewhat uncertain, the way tall men often look when they find themselves somewhere that wasn't designed with them in mind. He was 26, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that was a little too long and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in perhaps 4 days. His boots were worn but cared for. His hat was in his hands, which she noticed immediately because most men in Dustfield kept their hats on indoors as though removing them was an act of surrender. His eyes were dark brown and they were looking at her shop with the careful attention of a man who genuinely noticed things. "I heard you do alterations," he said. "The sign says so," Clara replied, not unkindly, but not with any particular warmth either. She had learned to be economical with warmth. It was something people took advantage of. He held out the jacket. "Sleeve came off. I've got a mending kit, but I can't." He stopped, looked slightly embarrassed. "My stitches come out like a drunk man walked across the fabric." Despite herself, Clara almost smiled. She took the jacket and examined the tear. It was a clean separation, the thread worn through rather than the fabric itself damaged, which meant it was a straightforward repair. She could have it done in an hour. 50 cents, she said. "Fair," he said. There was a moment where she expected him to leave because that was generally how it worked. Men dropped things off and came back when they were done. But he didn't immediately go. He stood there turning his hat in his hands and then he said, "You're the new woman at Mabel's." "I have my own shop now," Clara said, making a small point of the distinction. "Yes, ma'am, I can see that." He said it without any condescension, just acknowledgement. "I'm Eli Calloway. I work out at the Hargrove Ranch about 4 miles east of town." "I know the ranch," she said, though she didn't know him. The Hargrove Ranch was the largest operation in the area, running cattle on land that stretched toward the mountains. She'd heard the name. "Right," he nodded. "Well, I'll come back for it tomorrow if that suits you." "Tomorrow afternoon," she said. He put his hat back on, touched the brim in a gesture that was genuinely courteous rather than performative, and ducked back out through the doorway. Clara held the jacket for a moment after he left. Then she hung it on a hook, sat back down at her work table, and went back to the preacher's wife's skirt. She did not think about Eli Calloway for the remainder of that evening, or at least, that was what she told herself. He came back the next afternoon exactly when he said he would, which was the first thing she noted about him. Men in her experience were either early, which meant they were the kind who felt entitled to your time, or late, which meant they felt your time was less valuable than their own. He arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, which was when she had said, and he knocked on the door frame even though the door was open. She handed him the jacket. He looked at the repair with the same careful attention he'd applied to her shop the day before, running his thumb along the seam, checking the stitching. "That's remarkable work," he said, and he meant it, she could tell. He wasn't flattering her. He was genuinely observing something and reporting it. "It's a straightforward repair," she said. "I've seen straightforward repairs that look like a cat did them." He reached into his vest pocket for the coins. "You've been here a few weeks." 2.5, she said. "You settling in all right?" The question had layers to it that she didn't feel like excavating in the middle of a business transaction. "I have everything I need," she said, which was not exactly an answer but was not exactly a lie. He seemed to understand that she wasn't inviting further conversation, but he also didn't seem deterred by it. He paid her, thanked her in the same genuine, uncomplicated way he did everything, and left. He came back 2 weeks later with a pair of trousers that needed a new button and the hem let out. He had long legs. She noted this in a purely practical, professional sense. He came back 2 weeks after that with another ranch hand shirt, which he explained with some amusement had been torn in a disagreement, with offense that the ranch hand had lost comprehensively. Each time he arrived when he said he would. Each time he paid without quibbling. Each time he was in her shop for just a few minutes longer than strictly necessary, and their conversation extended, slowly and without pressure, the way a creek finds its way around stones, not forcing anything, just finding the natural path forward. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, the second of 4 boys, and had come north after his family's small cattle operation failed in a drought. She learned that he had worked 3 different ranches before Hargrove's, and that Hargrove suited him because Old Man Hargrove was fair and didn't ask for more than what was reasonable. She learned that he read, which surprised her slightly. He had a worn copy of David Copperfield in his saddlebag that he'd had for 2 years and had read 4 times. He learned that she could identify any fabric by touch alone. He learned that she had opinions about the quality of the thread available at the general store, which were strongly held and entirely accurate. He learned that she took her coffee with no sugar, and that she thought the preacher gave sermons that were 40 minutes too long. He did not ask about her bruise, which had faded by then but which she suspected he had noticed immediately in that first meeting, with those careful, observant eyes of his. He did not ask about her husband or where she had come from or why she had come alone. He asked about her work and her opinions and her day, and it was so extraordinarily refreshing that she found herself, by the time May had turned into June, looking forward to his visits in a way that alarmed her significantly. The town, meanwhile, continued to keep its running commentary on her prospects. She heard snatches of it through the thin walls of the general store, through the open windows of the saloon as she walked past, through the careful way some of the women in the church sewing circle spoke to her, as though she were a bird who might startle at a sudden noise and fly away. It wasn't malicious, exactly. It was just the way a town that had seen people come and go exercised its collective memory. They had watched hopeful women arrive before, women who thought a new place would change something fundamental about their circumstances, and they had watched those same women leave when the new place turned out to have all the same difficulties as the old one. They had a kind of rueful fatalism about it. They weren't betting against her out of cruelty. They were betting against her out of experience. But there was something about being the subject of a bet, even a casual, unspoken one, that Clara felt in her bones every morning when she unlocked her shop and every evening when she counted her earnings, which were, to her quiet satisfaction, growing. By June she had regulars. By July she had a waiting list for dress orders which she hadn't anticipated. The wife of the mines foreman needed a dress for her daughter's wedding, and had heard God bless the gossip network that had doubted her, that Clara Holt did the finest hand embroidery anyone had seen outside of San Francisco. The foreman's wife came in, looked at the samples Clara showed her, sat very quietly for a moment, and then said she would like to commission the full wedding trousseau. It was the biggest order Clara had received. She quoted a price that was fair and that would sustain her for 4 months, and the foreman's wife agreed without blinking. Clara stayed up late that night, sitting at her work table by lamplight, sketching out the designs for the trousseau, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself, not a wife, not a woman who had fled, not a bet someone was running odds on. Just herself, with her skills and her work and the particular quiet satisfaction of knowing she was good at something, and that that goodness was hers alone. It was the following week that things between her and Eli Calloway shifted, though she couldn't have pinpointed the exact moment. It happened the way most significant things happen, not all at once, but in a slow accumulation until one day you look up and everything is different. He had come in on a Tuesday, not for mending, just to see if she had the time to alter a dress shirt he'd bought at the general store that was too large in the shoulders. She was in the middle of pinning the wedding dress muslin, which required both her hands and considerable concentration, and she said so, and he said that was fine, he would wait, and then he sat down in the chair that was meant for customers and watched her work. No man had ever simply watched her work before. Douglas had ignored everything she did with her hands unless it was in service of something that benefited him. The men who came to her shop were polite, but awkward about being in a space that was hers. But Eli sat in the chair with his elbows on his knees and watched her pin the muslin with what she could only describe as genuine interest, the way you watch someone do something well and feel the pleasure of the competence itself. "Where did you learn all of this?" he asked after a while. "My mother," she said, reaching for another pin. "And her mother before her, and I paid attention." "You must have paid very close attention." "I didn't have a lot else to pay attention to," she said, and the moment the words were out she felt them land between them with a weight she hadn't intended. She kept her eyes on the fabric. "I'm sorry," he said, quietly and without prying. "Don't be," she said. "It gave me something worth keeping." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's a good way to think about it." They didn't speak again for a while, but the silence was comfortable in a way that surprised her. When she was done with the pinning, she turned to the shirt, took his measurements with brisk efficiency, and told him it would be ready Friday. On Friday he came back, and there was a moment when he was checking the fit of the shirt and she was adjusting the collar to lie flat, where her hands were very close to his face, and she became aware of his awareness of her, and she stepped back a fraction more than was strictly necessary. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. He said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I don't know what happened to you before you came here, and you don't owe me the story, but I want you to know," he stopped, seeming to consider his words. "I want you to know that I think Dustfield is lucky you stayed." She looked at him squarely because she was not a woman who looked away. "Most of Dustfield doesn't seem to share that view." "Most of Dustfield," he said, "makes a great many decisions on insufficient evidence." A pause. "I base my opinions on what I can see." She wanted to ask him what he could see, but she didn't. She folded her hands in front of her and met his eyes and said, 75 cents for the shirt." He smiled then, the first time she had seen him smile fully, not just the slight softening she'd noticed before, but an actual open smile that changed the whole tenor of his face, and he reached for his coins. She thought about that smile for the rest of the day in a way that was both pleasant and deeply inconvenient. July moved into August, and the Nevada heat settled over Dustfield like a hand pressed flat against the earth. Clara worked in her shop with the door open and a pitcher of water on the table and let herself feel, gradually and carefully, the particular pleasure of a life that was hers. She had enough money now not just for rent but for a small reserve. She had customers who came back. She had tentatively begun to have something resembling friends, the preacher's wife, a plain-spoken woman named Ruth, who respected competence above all things, and Mabel Trent, who still called at the boarding house occasionally and always brought something to eat. Eli Calloway came to town most Saturdays, as ranch hands typically did, for supplies and whatever sociability was available. He started finding reasons to stop at her shop. She started finding those reasons perfectly reasonable. One Saturday in August he asked if she would walk with him to the edge of town to see the sunset, and she said yes before she'd made any particular decision to say it, and they walked out past the last building and stood on the red dirt edge of the world while the sky turned colors that didn't have proper names, deep orange fading through pink to the faintest violet at the very top of the arch, and Eli said, "Texas sunsets were something, but this is different. The desert does it bigger." "It's the dust in the air," she said. "It scatters the light." He looked at her with a kind of warm curiosity. "How do you know that?" "My father was a school teacher," she said. "He taught us everything he could before." She stopped. "Before," he prompted gently. "Before things changed," she said. He nodded, didn't push. They stood and watched the sky go dark, and when she shivered slightly as the desert night came on fast the way it always does, he started to shrug off his jacket and then caught himself, leaving it half raised, an offering that wasn't quite an offer, and she reached over and took the edge of it and put it around her own shoulders before she'd thought too carefully about doing it. He looked at her. She looked at the first stars appearing in the sky above. "I need to tell you something," she said. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "I know," she said, "but I want to." She considered the stars for another moment. "I was married in Reno. His name was Douglas Holt. He was not a good man, or perhaps he was once before the drinking and she stopped again. I left when I was able to. I came here because it was far enough and small enough, and I thought perhaps I could make something that was entirely mine." She paused. "I am divorced. The papers came through in the spring before I arrived. I mention this not because it changes anything about our association, but because you should know the truth of me rather than whatever version the town has assembled." He was very quiet for a moment. The desert stretched out before them in the blue darkness, and somewhere far off a coyote called once and was silent. "The truth of you," Eli said slowly, "from where I'm standing, is a woman who built something remarkable from nothing in a town that wasn't particularly gracious about welcoming her, and who has more spine and more skill than anyone else I've met in this territory." He turned to look at her directly. "Whatever came before is yours to keep or share as you see fit. None of it changes the truth I've been watching." Clara felt something move in her chest that she had spent a considerable amount of effort keeping very still. She turned to look at him in the gathering dark and said, "You're a surprisingly decent man, Eli Calloway." "I'm trying to be," he said, and then, "May I call on you, properly, with whatever propriety looks like in a town this size?" She thought about it, not because she was uncertain, but because she was someone who thought carefully about things. Then she said, "You may call on me." He smiled again, and she thought, not for the first time, that it was a devastating smile for such a quiet, undemonstrative man. Word, of course, got around. By the following Tuesday, Pete Granger had already adjusted his predictions. "Well, she's still here," he allowed to anyone who would listen, "but you wait. The minute that Cowboy gets serious, she'll be gone. Women like that don't trust, can't trust. They've been burned and they run at the first sign of something real." The bet, which had started as a casual thing, had by now taken on the kind of low-grade town-wide investment that only happens in small places where entertainment is limited. It wasn't money changing hands, exactly, though Pete Granger had made a handshake agreement with the barber, Arlo Webb, over $1. It was more the collective expectation that had settled into the social fabric. The town had decided how this story ended, and they were watching to see if they were right. Clara knew about it. You could not live in a place this small and not know. And there was a particular ache to it that she hadn't anticipated, not anger exactly, but something lonelier than anger. The sense that even here, in the place she had chosen to remake herself, the narrative of who she was had been written by other hands. It was Eli, oddly enough, who found out before she did the specific terms that Pete Granger had shared widely, that the bet was not simply whether she would leave, but that she would leave specifically when she realized that anything real in Dustfield would only hurt her the same way things had hurt her before. He came to her shop on a Wednesday, which was not his usual day, and he sat down in the customer chair and leaned his elbows on his knees and said without preamble, "I heard what Pete Granger is saying about you." Clara kept sewing. "I've heard it too. It bothers you." "It bothers me that it bothers me," she corrected precisely. "I would prefer to be indifferent to the opinions of a man who smells of tobacco and has never once in his life done something that required courage." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it and not the way it might sound if you're being careful." She set down her sewing and looked at him. "I know that you have every reason in the world to be cautious," he said. "I know that what you've been through makes trust feel like something you can't afford. And I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm asking. I'm saying," he stopped, seemed to gather himself. "I'm saying that I would like to spend however much time it takes, whether that's months or years, demonstrating to you that not every man is what he was, and that this town's bet, whatever they think they know, is wrong. I'm not prepared to let their low expectations become your future." The shop was very quiet. Through the open door came the sounds of Dustfield going about its business boots on the boardwalk, the distant hammer of the blacksmith, a horse's restless shifting. Clara looked at Eli Calloway for a long time, at the earnestness in his face that was not the earnestness of someone performing sincerity, but of someone who was simply incapable of performing anything at all. "That's a very large thing to say," she said. "It is," he agreed. I mean it entirely. She picked up her sewing again, but her hands were not quite as steady as they'd been a moment before, and she thought he probably noticed. He noticed everything. "All right," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "All right," he repeated. "You may spend the time," she said. "We'll see what you do with it." The autumn came to the high desert in a way that Clara had not experienced before. Not the gentle gold of the east she'd read about, but a sharp copper and rust, the scrub oak going dark red, the air turning cold fast in the evenings while the days still carried heat. She had always loved autumn, though she hadn't expected to love the Nevada version of it, and she found herself spending her lunch hours walking the edges of town, learning the land the way you learn a new language, one word at a time. Eli took her riding on a Sunday in October, saddling a gentle sorrel mare from the ranch for her. She had ridden before, but not confidently, and he was patient in a way that was easy rather than condescending, explaining things once, clearly, and then letting her figure out the rest, which was exactly the right approach. They rode out into the desert, past the sagebrush and the scattered pinyons, up toward a low ridge where you could see the valley spread out below in the afternoon light. She found herself laughing at something, at the mare's opinionated response to a jackrabbit that exploded from a bush, a full, genuine laugh that surprised her with its own openness. Eli looked at her when she laughed, and there was something in his expression that was careful and warm and very serious all at once, and he looked away quickly before she could examine it too closely. "You haven't laughed like that before," he said. "Not that I've heard." "I haven't had much reason to," she said, and then, because the day was good and the air was clean and something felt possible, "I'm having reason now." He kept his eyes on the valley below, but his profile changed, a small, private smile that he was perhaps not aware of entirely. There were difficulties, as there always are. This is not a story without friction, because no honest love story is, and Clara Holt was not a woman who pretended difficulties away. In November, a man arrived in Dustfield. His name was William Pratt, and he was a lawyer from Reno, and he had been sent by Douglas Holt's family, because Douglas Holt had died in September of a liver complaint brought on by years of excessive drinking, and his family, who had never approved of the divorce and who had never approved of Clara, were making a legal claim that the divorce, finalized in the spring of 1878, had been improperly filed and was therefore invalid. The lawyer came to her shop on a gray November Tuesday and laid this out in the flat, emotionless way that lawyers are trained to deploy information as weapons. The essence of his visit was this: if the divorce was invalidated, Clara would be considered a widow rather than a divorced woman, and Douglas Holt's estate, which was considerable, would have claims against her by his family's accounting, claims she would need to contest legally and at considerable expense. After William Pratt left, Clara sat at her work table for a long time without sewing. She felt the cold of that particular Tuesday working its way in through the gaps in the shop's walls, and she looked at her hands on the table and thought about Douglas, whom she had not thought about in weeks with any particular force. He was dead. The fact of it settled strangely, not with grief exactly, but with the peculiar weight of a door finally, definitively closed, and she found that what she felt was something closer to a sad and distant pity for the man he might have been if he had been different. She told Eli that evening. She had not planned to. He had come by at the end of the day on his way back from a supply run, but she told him because she had discovered, gradually and with considerable surprise, that telling Eli things was easier than not telling him. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Have you spoken to anyone who knows the law?" "The only person in Dustfield who knows the law is Judge Mercer," she said, "and he is in his early stages of senility and cannot always be relied upon to remember which decade he is in." "There's a proper attorney in Carson City," Eli said. "A man named Foster. I've heard him spoken of as reliable. I can ride up there." "You don't need to do that," Clara said. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to. Let me write down what you know and I'll ride up Saturday." She looked at him. "Eli, this is not your problem." "No," he agreed. "But you are not your problem either, and I notice you've been solving yourself for quite a long time." He said it without any edge, just the simple directness that was characteristic of him. Let someone help. It was perhaps the most disarming thing anyone had ever said to her. She had been solving herself for so long that she had forgotten that it was possible to set the problem down for a moment. She nodded slowly. "All right." He rode to Carson City on Saturday and came back with the considered opinion of Mr. Foster, attorney, which was that the Holt family's claim was very thin indeed. The divorce had been properly filed and had been finalized with full legal standing in the state of Nevada before Douglas's death, and the family's assertion of improper filing would be difficult to prove and expensive for them to pursue. Mr. Foster had also, Eli mentioned, been quite firm in his letter to the family's representative that any further harassment of Mrs. Clara Holt, he had kept the name because it was hers now regardless of anything, would be met with a countersuit. Clara read the letter Eli brought back. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the tin box where she kept her important papers. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. They stood in the shop in the gray November light, and she thought that she was going to do something reckless and ill-advised, and then she did it anyway because she had been careful for long enough. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, her cheek against the broad, solid warmth of his chest, and felt him go very still for a surprised moment before his arms came around her with a gentleness that was almost undoing. "Clara," he said, into her hair. "Don't make too much of it," she said, against his vest. "I won't," he said. But she could feel the way he was holding her, careful and close, and she knew that they both knew that she didn't mean it. He kissed the top of her head very softly, and she thought, "I am in considerable trouble here, and I find that I am entirely at peace with it." December came. The nights dropped well below freezing, and the days were short and brilliantly clear, the sky a deep, aching blue. Clara's shop was warm from the small iron stove she'd bought in October, and she had draped the window display with a bit of red ribbon for the Christmas season, which made Mabel Trent very approving and Pete Granger deeply cynical. She and Eli had dinner at the hotel dining room on a Saturday in early December, which qualified as a significant social occasion in Dustfield and was observed by approximately half the town at various points. She wore her second-best dress, which was a dark blue wool that she'd altered to fit her perfectly, and Eli wore his good shirt, which she had mended twice now and which fit him very well across the shoulders. They talked for 3 hours. She could not afterward have reconstructed everything they talked about, only the shape of it, easy and warm, ranging from the practical to the impractical, from the mining operations and their effect on the land to the novels they had each read, to the question of whether Dustfield would still be standing in 20 years, once the silver ran out, which was a real and looming concern that the town preferred not to examine too closely. She told him about her father, the schoolteacher, who had died of typhoid when she was 15. She told him about her mother's difficult years after, and the way the difficult years had narrowed their choices until marrying Douglas had seemed like the only reasonable door open to her. She said this plainly, without self-pity, which was the only way she knew how to say hard things. Eli told her about a man he'd worked for in Texas, before the ranch failed, who had been the most genuinely good man he'd ever known, a man who treated his hands fairly and his animals kindly, and his wife like she was the most interesting person in any room she entered. He said he had spent a great deal of his adult life using that man as a kind of North Star for how to orient himself. "What was his name?" Clara asked. "James Aldridge," Eli said. "He died the winter the drought hit. Heart gave out." He looked at his coffee cup. "I've thought about him more than I've thought about most people. I think the people who show us what's possible stay with us more than the ones who only show us what is," she said. Eli looked at her with those warm, careful eyes. "That's exactly right." After dinner he walked her back to her shop, because she sometimes slept there now in a small cot behind the curtain partition when it was too cold to walk back to Mabel's, and they stood outside in the freezing December night with their breath making small clouds, and the stars absolutely fierce and innumerable above the desert. He said, "Clara, I'm in love with you." He said it the way he said everything, without fanfare or performance, just the plain statement of a thing that was true. She looked up at him, at his face in the starlight, at the absolute steady certainty in his expression, and she felt the full force of it move through her the way the cold did all the way in. "I know," she said, and then, "I'm afraid." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to be unafraid. I'm asking you to stay afraid and stay anyway." She thought about Pete Granger's bet. She thought about the town watching. She thought about every reason she had to be careful, and she thought about Eli riding to Carson City on a December Saturday because someone needed to help and he was the person who wanted to do it. She thought about his arms around her in the shop and the way she had felt, for the first time in years, like the weight she carried had somewhere to set itself down. "I am in love with you also," she said. "God help me." He laughed, surprised, free, delighted, and she laughed too, and he took her face in his hands and kissed her in the street under the December stars, and it was cold and real and the most completely right thing that had happened to her in as long as she could remember. Winter settled deep over Dustfield in January and February of 1879. The mine had a difficult stretch, a cave-in in February that, thankfully, injured no one seriously but slowed operations significantly and put a worried look on every face in town. Clara kept her shop open, kept her orders moving, spent her evenings at the little iron stove with her sketchbook and her thoughts. Eli came to town on Saturdays without fail. Occasionally, he managed a midweek visit when errands brought him to town. He brought her things, not expensive things, because neither of them had money for expensive things, but things he'd noticed she would like. A twist of good quality black thread from the general store that was better than the usual stock, a dried sprig of something that smelled of the desert in summer, a copy of a Harper's Monthly that had come into the general store, and that he'd set aside for her because there was an article about new fabric dye techniques from the East. She kept the Harper's Monthly on the corner of her work table. She wasn't sure he knew that. She had been sewing a great deal in the evenings lately, working on something she hadn't told him about, a piece for herself, a dark green dress with small embroidered flowers at the collar and cuffs, the finest embroidery she'd done on her own behalf since she couldn't remember when. She made it because she wanted it, because she finally had the space and the stability to make things just because she wanted them, and she recognized that as a kind of milestone worth marking. She wore it to church on a Sunday in March, and Eli, who was in the pew beside her, which was now their established place, the two of them side by side, which the town had accepted with the kind of resigned satisfaction of people who had been watching a story they thought they'd predicted, and who were not entirely displeased to be finding it more complex than expected, looked at her when she sat down and said, very quietly, "That's new." "I made it for myself," she said. He looked at the embroidered flowers at her collar. "It's extraordinary." "I know," she said mildly. He bit back a smile. She watched the preacher begin his sermon with the particular expression of someone who is very happily occupied with their own thoughts. It was in March that Pete Granger, of all people, came to her shop. He came in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, turning his hat in his hands. She noted the hat immediately, how it mimicked Eli's gesture from that first visit, and she found it interesting what habit could do, and he stood in her shop looking around at it with an expression that was not quite humble but was at least approaching the suburbs of humility. "Miss Holt," he said. "Mr. Granger," she said. He cleared his throat. "I've been coming in to see about a commission if you've got the time for it." She did have the time. The wedding trousseau was complete and the follow-on orders, while plentiful, were manageable. "What's the commission?" he coughed. "My sister is coming from Sacramento in May for a visit. She's," another cough. "She's recently widowed. I was thinking perhaps a new dress, something nice." She's always been fond of nice things and she hasn't had easy circumstances. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who had underestimated her, and that was a thing she wasn't obligated to forgive. But she was also a practical woman who understood that people could sometimes find their way to better behavior even if the route was circuitous. And there was something touching about this large, stubborn, tobacco-smelling man coming to her for help with something for his widowed sister. "Tell me about her," Clara said. "Her coloring, her measurements if you know them, her preferences." Pete Granger described his sister, Dorothy, with a particularity that suggested he paid more attention to the people he loved than his public manner implied. Clara took notes. She quoted a fair price. He paid half in advance without being asked. At the door he stopped. Without turning around, he said, "You've done well here, Miss Holt, better than I reckoned." "Yes," she said, "I have." He went out. Clara sat with her notes for a moment and then she smiled privately and to herself and went back to work. She told Eli about it that Saturday. He shook his head slowly, somewhere between amusement and exasperation. "Old Pete," he said. "He's not a bad man, just a stubborn one." "Most stubborn people aren't bad," Clara said, "just inconvenient. Is that what you thought of me when you met me?" "When I met you," she said, thinking back, "I thought you were very large and surprisingly tidy about your hat." He laughed. "That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Reserved, perhaps. Guarded." She considered him with her head tilted slightly. "I was both of those things. I simply also noticed your hat." He reached across the work table and took her hand, and she let him, because she had been letting him hold her hand for months now, and it still felt like something warm and particular and real. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, because she could hear something in his voice that told her this was going to be a significant sentence. He took a breath. "I've been thinking about asking you something, and I've been working up to it for a while, and I'm aware that you value directness, so I'm going to be direct." He met her eyes. "Will you marry me?" He said it without a question mark, because his voice didn't rise at the end, it landed level and certain, the way he said everything important. The shop was quiet. Outside, Dustfield went about its Saturday business. Clara looked at their joined hands, at the worktable covered in fabric and thread, and the tools of the life she had built from the wreckage of a previous one. She thought about trust, which was still not easy, and about love, which she had discovered was a different thing from trust, older and simpler and less cautious. She thought about Eli Calloway, who had sat in her customer's chair and watched her work with genuine interest, who had ridden to Carson City on a winter Saturday, who said, "I mean it entirely," and demonstrated that he did. "There is something I need you to understand first," she said. "All right," he said. "I will not be a woman who belongs to someone," she said. "Not again. What I have built here," she gestured at the shop, at the sketchbooks and the fabric and the sign in the window. "This is mine. It will remain mine. I will not give it up for anyone, including you, and I will not diminish what I am to fit into a smaller space." He looked at her with absolute seriousness. "Clara, I would not ask you to fit into a smaller space. I would rather expand to fit yours." She felt something give way in her, very quietly, the way ice gives way in spring, not all at once, but in a long, slow release. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through. They were married in June of 1879, a year and 2 months after Clara had arrived in Dustfield with a carpet bag and a bruised jaw and the town's collective disbelief riding on her shoulders. The wedding was small. Ruth, the preacher's wife, stood up for Clara. Tom Haskell, one of the other ranch hands from Hargroves who had become Eli's closest friend, stood up for Eli. The preacher gave, for once, a very short and heartfelt address that almost made Clara cry, though she held it together because she had already cried twice that morning and had a limit. Mabel Trent brought food. Pete Granger came to the church and sat in the back and looked, for a man who had spent a year betting on the wrong outcome, remarkably content. Clara wore the dark green dress with the embroidered flowers. She had added a length of cream lace at the collar that she'd been given by the foreman's wife as a wedding gift, and she had dressed her hair herself in the cracked mirror above the wash basin at Mabel's, which was where she'd started, and she had looked at herself there in the mirror, and felt the full strange weight of how far a year could take a person. Eli was waiting at the front of the church in his good shirt and a dark jacket he'd borrowed from Tom and the boots he kept polished. When she walked in through the doors on the arm of old Arlo Webb, who had offered to stand in for her father since there was no one else, she watched Eli's face as he saw her, and what she saw there was something she had not expected from a man as composed as he generally was. He looked like someone seeing something he had not quite let himself fully believe in until the moment it was irrefutably real. She walked to him. He took her hand. The preacher spoke. They made their promises to each other in the clear June morning light, and Clara said hers with the steadiness of someone who had thought about every word and meant each one completely. Afterward, standing outside the church in the sunshine while Mabel and Ruth fussed over the wedding supper arrangements, Eli leaned down and said quietly, close to her ear, "The town bet you'd run." "I know," she said. "They were wrong," he said. "They were wrong," she agreed. He straightened up, looked out at Dustfield, the main street with its familiar buildings, the mine road heading east, the mountains blue in the distance. "I intend to spend a considerable amount of time being glad they were wrong." She leaned against him slightly, just her shoulder to his arm, and looked at the same view. "So do I," she said. They set up their household in a way that required considerable practical negotiation, which they approached with the kind of direct, good-humored practicality that would become the characteristic mode of their partnership. Clara kept her shop. This had never been in question, but it was nevertheless settled explicitly. The shop was hers, its income was hers, and she would manage it as she saw fit. Eli earned his wage at the ranch and contributed his portion to their shared household, which they agreed on together, as equals. They found a small house at the edge of town, 2 rooms, a kitchen, a good stove, and a yard large enough for a kitchen garden, that they rented at a price that was manageable if careful, and they spent the better part of 2 weekends making it habitable with the combined labor of both of them and the enthusiastic, if occasionally counterproductive, assistance of Tom Haskell. Clara planted a kitchen garden in July, because she had always wanted one and never had one, and she took the same careful approach to it that she took to everything: reading, planning, paying attention. And it produced, that first partial season, more tomatoes than 2 people could reasonably eat, which she distributed among the neighbors with a generosity that surprised people who had expected her to remain self-contained. The town's bet had technically been lost, and they all knew it, but nobody said so directly except Tom Haskell, who mentioned it at supper one evening in a way that made Eli laugh and Clara raise an eyebrow. "What exactly were the terms?" she asked. Tom, who had perhaps not expected to be directly questioned, said that Pete Granger had bet Arlo Webb $1 that she'd be gone by summer of '78, had revised the bet to gone by the time Calloway gets serious, and had finally, somewhere in November, stopped making revisions. "He came to my shop in March to commission a dress for his sister," Clara said. Tom looked delighted. "Old Pete came into your shop." "He stood at the door turning his hat in his hands," Clara said, "and told me I'd done better than he'd reckoned, which I took to be approximately the most concession that man has ever made in his life." "That's Pete's version of a full apology," Eli said. "I gave him a fair price on the dress," Clara said. "That was my version of accepting it." The dress for Dorothy Granger, Pete's widowed sister, had been delivered in May, before the wedding. Dorothy herself had arrived from Sacramento and had come to the shop to be fitted, and she had turned out to be a spare, sharp-eyed woman of 40 who was nothing at all like her brother, and who appreciated Clara's work with the critical eye of someone who knew exactly what quality looked like. Dorothy Granger had come to the wedding and had brought a very fine linen handkerchief as a gift, which she said she'd brought from Sacramento, and she looked at Clara and Eli with an expression that was brisk and approving and said, "Good. Someone in this family should be making sensible decisions." She said it loudly enough that Pete, standing nearby, developed a sudden interest in the pattern on the church ceiling. Dorothy stayed in Dustfield longer than her planned visit. She was, as she explained to Clara one afternoon in the shop while Clara was pinning a repair to one of her traveling dresses, finding that Sacramento had certain associations she was not ready to return to, and Dustfield, while small and somewhat provincial, had the considerable advantage of being somewhere new. Clara understood this perfectly. By October, Dorothy had taken a room at the hotel and was quietly in the process of discussing with Mabel Trent the possibility of helping manage the boarding house, a negotiation that Mabel was approaching with her characteristic combination of warmth and firm conditions. Clara suspected this was going to result in an arrangement that suited both of them very well. Life in the house at the edge of town settled into its rhythms. Eli left before dawn for the ranch on weekdays, as ranch work demands. Clara was at her shop by 8, open by 9. They ate supper together in the evenings, sometimes in companionable near silence if it had been a long day, sometimes in the extensive conversation that was one of the particular pleasures of having married someone who was genuinely interesting. She learned his interior in the way you learn someone you live with, not all at once, but in the slow accumulation of details that daily life provides. She learned that he was at his most talkative in the morning, before he left for the ranch, and at his most quiet in the early evening when he first came home and needed perhaps a half-hour of peace before he was ready for company. She accommodated this without comment, and he was grateful without making too much of the gratitude. She learned that he could not abide a dirty boot, and that he had an unreasonable opinion about the correct way to stack wood. She learned that he sometimes had nightmares, quiet ones, no more than a slight restlessness and a tightening of his face, and that on those mornings he was up before her, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the desert, and that what he needed in those moments was not questions but simply presence. He learned that she was fiercely particular about her work bag, and that no one should ever move anything in it, including him, regardless of apparent good intentions. He learned that she read slowly and carefully, the way she sewed, and that she remembered everything she read. He learned that she sang under her breath when she worked, very quietly, old songs she'd learned from her mother, and that she was almost certainly not aware she was doing it. He learned that the shoulder that still occasionally ached on cold mornings was the left one, and that she never mentioned it, and that what he could do was build the fire up particularly well on cold mornings without making it into a point. In the spring of 1880, Clara became pregnant. She knew it before she told anyone, sitting with the knowledge quietly for a few days while she assessed how she felt about it. She found that she felt, surprisingly to herself, deeply settled. Not without apprehension. Apprehension was reasonable, but settled in a way that was about knowing, very clearly, that this child would come into a different world than the one she had been afraid of. She told Eli on a Sunday evening while they were sitting on the back step of the house watching the last light go off the desert. She said it simply, and he was very still for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Are you well?" He asked first because that was the kind of man he was. "I'm well," she said. "I'm better than well." He put his arm around her there on the back step, and they sat in the evening warmth looking at the desert, and after a while he said, "I'm going to need to learn an unreasonable number of things in a relatively short time." "You learn quickly," she said. "Not as quickly as you," he said. "I'll help," she said. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I know you will." She continued working through most of the pregnancy, which made some of the town's women raise their eyebrows, but which Clara considered perfectly sensible. She hired a girl, the 15-year-old daughter of one of the mine workers, a quick and willing young woman named Alice who turned out to have excellent hands and a real aptitude for sewing, to help with the more complex orders. And Alice's wages were the first wages Clara had ever paid anyone, which felt like its own kind of milestone. The baby came in November of 1880, attended by the doctor, who had considerably reduced his drinking since the arrival of his wife's disapproving sister in the spring, and by Ruth, the preacher's wife, who had delivered a great many babies in her years in the territory, and who was exactly the calm and capable presence Clara had hoped for. It was a boy. They named him James, for the man Eli had described on that first dinner at the hotel, the rancher who had been a North Star, who had treated his wife like the most interesting person in any room she entered. Eli looked at the baby with the expression of someone encountering something entirely unprecedented, and Clara, exhausted and aching and profoundly happy, watched him hold his son for the first time and felt something complete close around her like a hand. James Calloway was a loud, sturdy, opinionated baby who slept enthusiastically when he slept and protested vigorously when he did not, and who from the first weeks of his life seemed to regard the world with a kind of bold curiosity that Clara recognized and Eli found endlessly interesting. Mabel Trent came to meet him, and pronounced him the finest baby she'd seen in 15 years, which Clara suspected was something Mabel said to everyone but which felt genuine. Dorothy Granger came and brought a very good wool blanket she'd ordered from a supplier in Sacramento and said, examining the baby with her spare, analytical eye, that he had excellent ears. "Thank you," Eli said with complete seriousness. "I mean they're well formed," Dorothy clarified. "Still thank you," Eli said. Pete Granger came at the end of the week, hat in hands at the front door, and spent approximately 45 minutes sitting in the kitchen with Clara and the baby looking utterly delighted and saying almost nothing, which was so unlike his usual behavior that Clara found it more touching than anything he could have said. As 1881 moved in, Dustfield faced a real reckoning that had been quietly approaching for several years. The silver mine's output had been declining steadily, and by midsummer it was clear that the main vein was effectively exhausted. The mine company announced reduced operations in August and full closure scheduled for the following spring. This was not a surprise exactly, but the confirmation of it hit the town like a cold wind. Families began to leave. The population, which had been around 400 at its height, started dropping. The saloon's owner left by the fall. Two of the families whose daughters Clara had dressed for dances, and whose wives were among her regulars, packed their wagons and headed for Carson City or Salt Lake or further west. It was, frankly, exactly the situation the town had been worried about during that dinner with Eli when they talked about whether Dustfield would still be here in 20 years, and the answer was beginning to look uncertain. Eli and Clara talked about it at length on the back step one warm August evening, James asleep inside, the desert quiet around them. "Some people are saying we should go to Carson City," Eli said. "Or Reno." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want what's best for us," he said, "which is not an evasion, it's the actual truth. I've lived in enough places that geography matters less to me than the people I'm with." Clara thought about it. Her shop, her regulars were thinning as families left, but there were still people here, and the people who stayed tended to be the ones with the most need for reliable services. She thought about Ruth, who was staying because the preacher was staying because someone needed to tend to the community that remained. She thought about Dorothy, who had invested herself in the boarding house and was not the sort to be dislodged easily. She thought about Alice, who was 17 now and who had become genuinely skilled and who would lose her income if Clara left. "I want to stay," she said, "for now. Not forever necessarily, but I started something here. I'm not finished with it." Eli nodded. "Then we stay." "You're sure?" He looked at her. "Clara, I said I would spend my life proving them wrong. I didn't mean for a limited time." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, a nighthawk called in the dark sky, and the desert breathed its dry, sage-scented breath around them. Old Man Hargrove, whose ranch had sustained itself through the mine's boom and who had been careful with his money over the years, announced in September that he intended to expand his cattle operation rather than contract it, reasoning that the land that had fed the mine workers would need to feed something else. and that grass was grass regardless of what the silver was doing underground. He hired 2 additional hands and negotiated a supply contract with a livestock buyer in Carson City, and the Hargrove Ranch became, in the economy of a contracting Dustfield, one of its steadier pillars. Eli, who had been one of Hargrove's most reliable hands for several years now, was offered the role of foreman when the previous foreman left for California. He came home that evening and stood in the kitchen while Clara made supper and told her about it, and she turned around from the stove with a spatula in her hand and looked at him. "You should take it," she said. "It's more responsibility," he said. "Longer days sometimes." "You've been doing the work of a foreman for 2 years," she said. "You should be paid like one," he smiled. "I thought you might say something like that." "Take the offer," she said, "and negotiate the wage up by 15% before you accept." He raised his eyebrows. 15% is significant. "You know what you're worth," she said. He took the offer. He negotiated the wage. Hargrove agreed to the increase without much resistance, because he knew, as Eli knew, that Eli was the most capable man on the ranch, and that the cost of losing him would far exceed the additional wage. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was a hard one, colder than usual, and Dustfield felt smaller around the remaining residents in a way that could have been lonely but which, Clara found, was more like the feeling of a community that had reduced itself to its essentials. The people who remained were there because they had decided to be, which meant they were generally the kind of people who made active decisions rather than passive ones, and there was something strengthening about that. Clara's shop had evolved. With fewer customers for fine dresses, she had expanded into what she privately thought of as useful sewing, repairing and adapting and creating functional garments for a population that needed durability as much as beauty. She had also, on a practical suggestion from Dorothy, begun teaching, a small sewing class held on Thursday evenings in her shop, for women and girls who wanted to learn. It brought in a modest income, and it brought something else too, the specific pleasure of watching someone discover that their hands could make something fine. Alice had become, by this point, not just a helper but a genuine partner in the shop's work. She was 18, quick and creative, and she had developed a particular facility for practical alterations that Clara encouraged and paid fairly for. When Alice's family talked about leaving Dustfield for Carson City, Clara sat down and had a direct conversation with Alice's parents about the possibility of Alice staying, with a formal employment arrangement and a residence at Mabel's boarding house, and Alice's parents, who trusted Clara, agreed. James, at 13 months, was moving through the world with the busy determination of a small person who has recently discovered that movement is possible, and has decided to apply this discovery comprehensively to every available surface. He was, by all accounts, an exceptionally good-natured child, curious and sociable, showing something of his father's quiet observation combined with something of his mother's precise attention to detail, and an entirely his own quality of sunny stubbornness that Clara suspected was entirely original. In March of 1882, on a quiet evening when James was asleep and they were sitting by the stove with books, Eli set his book down and said, "I've been thinking about something." Clara turned a page. "Thinking or deciding?" "Thinking toward deciding," he said. She set her own book down and gave him her full attention because he did not use that phrase lightly. "Hargrove has talked about selling part of his land," Eli said. "The south section, about 250 acres. It's good land, good grazing, it has a creek that runs reliably, there's a site that would take a house." He paused. "I've been watching the pricing, with what I've saved and what we have between us, and if we were to take a loan from the Territorial Bank in Carson City, we could buy it." Clara was very still. "Our own land." "Our own land," he said. "Our own operation, small to start. Maybe 30 head, but it's ours." She looked at him across the lamplight. She thought about the word ours and how it had taken on a completely different quality than it had once had, not a claim but an alliance. "How long have you been thinking about this?" she asked. "Since Hargrove mentioned selling," he said. "About 8 months, and you're ready to decide." "I'm ready to decide together," he said. "It's not just my decision." She looked at him with the particular steadiness that was so specifically hers. "We would need to be careful with the loan." "Very careful," he agreed. "And the shop stays mine," she said. "The shop has always been yours," he said simply. She thought about it for a while, looking at the stove's steady glow. She thought about her kitchen garden, about how satisfying it had been to make something grow on land you knew. She thought about James learning to walk in the yard, and what it would mean for him to grow up knowing that the land under his feet was his family's. She thought about Eli, who had spent his life working other men's land, and what it would mean to him to build something of his own. "We should ride out and look at it," she said. He smiled at her. "We should." They rode out on a Sunday in early April. James bundled between them on the mare, because he was old enough now to find horse riding a source of profound delight, and young enough to still require a steadying arm. The south section was exactly as Eli had described: rolling land with good grass coming up in the spring green, a line of cottonwoods along the creek, and a rise of ground with a view of the mountains that was genuinely breathtaking. They stopped at the rise and looked at the view, and James pointed at the mountains with great conviction and said something that was not quite a word but was clearly intended to be significant. "He approves," Eli said. "He approves of most things at this stage," Clara said. "He approved of eating dirt last Tuesday." "He has a broad palate," Eli said. She looked at the land spreading out below the rise, the creek threading through the cottonwoods, the grass catching the April light, the distance going blue toward the mountains. She felt the same thing she had felt in the shop when she'd first gotten the trousseau commission, that particular specific certainty of something that is right. "Yes," she said. Eli looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "We should buy it." The purchase took the better part of 3 months to negotiate and finalize, involving 2 trips to Carson City to meet with the territorial bank, a formal surveying that took a week, and a great deal of paperwork that made both of them briefly grateful for Mr. Foster, the attorney, who handled the land deed documentation. By July of 1882, the land was theirs. The house came next, which they planned together on winter evenings, Clara with her draftsman's eye for space and detail, Eli with his practical knowledge of what materials and construction methods the territory could provide. They contracted with a builder in Dustfield who had remained because he had enough work with the town's ongoing maintenance, and who was glad for the job. They broke ground in August, and the shell of the house was up by October, and they moved in the following spring, before it was entirely finished but livably complete, with James toddling through the new rooms with his characteristic investigative attitude. It was a house that felt entirely different from any other house Clara had lived in. She had lived in her parents' house, in boarding houses, in Douglas Holt's house in Reno that had felt like his regardless of what he said, in the rented rooms at the edge of Dustfield. This house sat on their land and had been planned by both of them, and every room in it was built with the specific understanding of who they were. The kitchen was large and practical. There was a room with good north light that was Clara's workroom, not a shop, but a space for the sewing she did at home, for the designing and the teaching she continued there when the evening class moved to the house. There was a porch that faced east, toward the mountains, and they sat on it in the early mornings before the day demanded anything. Alice came out to the land sometimes in the evenings, riding the sorrel mare that had been Clara's wedding ride, and which Clara kept at the ranch now, and she and Clara would work in the back room or sit on the porch and talk about the work, about the customers in town, about the world that the two of them were individually and together building in this corner of the Nevada territory. Dorothy Granger, who had by now established herself so thoroughly in Mabel Trent's boarding house operation that the two of them had become something between business partners and best friends, came out on Sundays with Pete, whenever Pete came to see them, which was often, because Pete Granger had managed, in the years since his early betting against her, to become genuinely fond of Clara in the blunt, awkward way of someone who doesn't quite know how to express fondness but keeps showing up anyway. In the fall of 1883, their second child was born. Another boy, which delighted James, who had been told he was getting a sibling and who had taken this information very seriously, inspecting it from various angles over the preceding months. They named the second boy Thomas, for Tom Haskell, Eli's oldest friend from the ranch, who had stood up for him at the wedding and who had remained at the Hargrove Ranch and who was, by now, someone Clara considered family in the practical, earned sense of the word. Tom Haskell, presented with this honor, looked at the baby with an expression of profound overwhelm and said, "That's an awful lot of responsibility for a man who can't even reliably stack wood." "Clara's already corrected Eli on the wood stacking," said Ruth, who had heard this story several times. "I'm sure she'll correct you too." Thomas was quieter than James had been as a baby, more observant, more patient, with dark eyes that tracked the world with Eli's particular quality of attentive calm. He and James, despite their different temperaments, were from early infancy deeply attached to each other, James managing his younger brother with proprietary concern and Thomas accepting this management with serene good humor. The land prospered in the particular, modest way of small cattle operations in the high desert, not dramatically, not as a source of sudden wealth, but as a steady and reliable foundation that rewarded attention and care. Eli was good with cattle in the way that some people are good with things that require patience and observation, and the herd grew slowly and steadily toward something genuinely viable. Clara's shop in Dustfield remained open, though her hours had shifted over the years. Alice now managed the day-to-day operation largely independently, with Clara coming in 3 days a week and handling the design and the complex orders, which suited them both. Alice, at 20, was by any reasonable measure a skilled seamstress, and Clara had begun talking to her about the possibility of eventually buying out the shop entirely if Alice wished to, which was something Alice was thinking about with the careful seriousness that Clara recognized as characteristic of people who take their futures seriously. It was a Tuesday in the spring of 1884, a day so beautiful that the desert seemed to have polished itself specifically for the occasion, the air clear and warm and carrying the smell of sage, that Clara came home in the late afternoon and found Eli sitting on the east porch, and he had a piece of paper in his hand that he was looking at the way he looked at things he was still deciding how to feel about. She sat down beside him. He handed her the paper. It was a letter. From a woman named Margaret, who had been a friend of Eli's mother in Texas, and who wrote to tell him that his mother, Edna Calloway, had died in February of a chest ailment, and that she had thought he should know, though she understood he had been away from Texas for many years. Clara read it and then folded it and gave it back and sat beside him without speaking, because she understood the particular weight of news that arrives late, that you receive alone because the distance between you and the place of the grief is so large that the grief has already happened without you, and all you receive is the information of it. After a while he said, "We were not close, in the end. She didn't understand why I left. She thought I should have stayed and tried harder to make the land work." He paused, "But she was my mother." "Yes," Clara said. "I should have written more," he said. "You should have," she said honestly. "And you didn't, and that's something you'll carry, but it doesn't mean the sum of who you are is measured by the letters you didn't write." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Say the honest thing and still make it bearable." She thought about it. "Because the honest thing is more bearable than the comfortable lie," she said. "You always know where you are with the truth." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, the porch boards warm under them, the mountains going gold in the afternoon light. "I'm glad I'm here," he said. "I'm glad I'm here with you." "So am I," she said. From inside the house came the sound of James and Thomas engaged in some dispute about something that appeared to require both elevated voices and the occasional thump, and Clara and Eli sat on the porch and listened to it for a moment with the particular parental expression of people assessing whether the situation requires intervention. "James," Eli said, at a volume that carried indoors without shouting. The thumping stopped. "That will last approximately 2 minutes," Clara said. "About that," Eli agreed. It lasted 3, which was better than expected, and then the boys came out onto the porch, James first long-legged at nearly 4, with Clara's precision and Eli's observation, and Thomas behind him, solid and unhurried and looking entirely unmoved by whatever had occurred. James immediately began explaining the dispute with the prosecutorial thoroughness of a child who has decided his case is airtight. Thomas looked at the mountains. Clara listened to James with the attentive gravity his narrative required. Eli caught Thomas and deposited him in his lap, where Thomas settled with perfect equanimity and pointed at a hawk circling in the distance. "Hawk," Thomas said. He was working on his words with the methodical determination characteristic of him. "That's right," Eli said. Clara reached across and put her hand over Eli's, between the boys, on the warm boards of the porch, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat in the spring afternoon watching the hawk circle, and listening to James explain his grievances with great passion, and looking out at the land that was theirs, the grass and the creek and the mountains going gold. And it was, in the most complete and unambiguous way Clara Holt Calloway had ever understood the word home. Dustfield did not die, though it contracted significantly in the years after the mine closed. By 1885, its population had settled at around 150 people, the ranching families, the service workers, the ones who had decided that the smaller version of the place was still worth staying for. It was quieter and tighter, and in some ways better, the way a soup is better when it's reduced to its essence. Clara kept her shop, with Alice increasingly at the center of it. Alice, at 22, had become the kind of woman who commanded the shop's interior completely, and Clara was in the process of formally negotiating the buyout arrangement they had discussed years earlier, which would transfer ownership to Alice over 3 years of payments, a structure that Alice had worked out herself on paper, and presented to Clara with the same careful directness that Clara recognized as something she had modeled and Alice had made her own. "You've done well," Clara told her, looking at the payment structure. "I had a good teacher," Alice said. "You had potential," Clara said. "You did the rest." Alice took possession of the shop in 1886, with her name on a new sign that Clara helped her letter, and on the day the sign went up, Clara stood on the boardwalk outside and looked at it with a feeling that was entirely warm and had no regret in it whatsoever. Eli saw her standing there when he came to collect her for the ride home, and he came and stood beside her, looking at the sign. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like something I made," she said. "That turned out bigger than I planned." He put his hand at her back. "Everything you make does that." She looked at him sideways. "That was surprisingly poetic." "I've been practicing," he said. She laughed, and he smiled at the laugh the way he always had, the way she had first noticed it on that October sunset ride in 1878, like it was something rare and worth attending to. They rode home in the late afternoon, the Nevada sky doing its dramatic best above them, the land rolling out in the light toward the mountains. Their land, their house on the rise. The smoke from the evening fire already beginning to show, which meant that Maria, the woman who helped with the house 2 days a week since Thomas had arrived, had gotten the supper started. James was at the fence when they rode in, working on a knot with the focused absorption of a child who has decided to learn something and is not accepting failure. Thomas was sitting on the fence post watching him with the patient air of a younger brother who has long since decided that James's projects are more interesting than his own most days. "He's been at that knot for an hour," Thomas said by way of greeting. "It's a good knot to know," Eli said, swinging down and going to look at what James was doing. He crouched beside his son and looked at the half-formed knot with genuine interest. "You've got the first half right. The second half goes this way." Clara dismounted and stood watching Eli and James at the fence, and Thomas climbed down from the fence post and came and stood beside her, leaning against her leg with the comfortable weight of a child who knows exactly where he is in the world. "Mama," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. "Is supper soon?" "Very soon," she said. "Good," he said, and leaned against her leg again. She put her hand on his hair and watched Eli show James the knot, watched James's face when he got it right, that particular light that children's faces make when understanding arrives. And she thought about Pete Granger's bet, which seemed now like something from a very long time ago, something that had happened to a different version of herself in a different version of the world. They had been wrong. The town had been wrong, with the best of intentions and all the evidence of their experience. And they had been wrong because what they had predicted was a woman who would run. And what they had gotten instead was a woman who had decided to be a root growing down, holding, staying. And Eli Calloway, who had said he would spend his life proving them wrong, had done exactly that, not by making a grand gesture of it, but by being, every day, exactly what he'd said he was. Fair and steady and interested and honest and there, every morning, every evening, every cold day and warm day and complicated day, standing with his hand at her back and his eyes on the world ahead of them. That evening, after supper and after the boys were in bed, James asleep immediately with the uncomplicated depth of a child who has used the day completely, Thomas reading to himself in his small, quiet way before his lamp went out. Clara and Eli sat on the east porch in the warm summer night with coffee and the particular comfortable silence that belonged to them. The stars were out in their thousands, the way they are in the desert, more stars than seems possible, the whole sky absolutely full of them. "I've been thinking," Clara said. "Thinking or deciding," Eli said. She smiled. "Both, possibly. Tell me." "I've been thinking about teaching more formally," she said. "Not just the sewing class. A proper instruction, the kind that gives women practical skills they can use to earn their own living." She paused. "There's nothing like that in Dustfield or within a considerable distance of it. Women who need to support themselves have very few paths." Eli was quiet for a moment. "You want to start a school?" "A working school," she said. "Not just theory, practical skills. Dressmaking, alterations, the business side of it. How to price, how to manage money, how to run a small operation." She thought of herself, arriving in Dustfield with a carpet bag and a bruised jaw, knowing what she knew about fabric and thread and not much else about how to turn it into a life. "Someone should have taught me those things earlier. I'd like to teach them to others." He looked at her in the starlight. "Where would you hold it?" "The house has the workroom," she said. "I've thought about it. I could teach 2 students at a time, perhaps 3, to a level where they're genuinely competent and genuinely ready. And Alice, I think Alice would be interested in taking students herself in the shop. She's a natural teacher." Eli was nodding slowly. "You've thought about it a great deal." "I have," she said. "Then do it," he said. She looked at him. "Clara," he said, "in all the time I've known you, have you ever started something that didn't turn into something worth having?" She thought about the shop, about James and Thomas, about Alice, about the land under them, about the sewing school that was, even now, taking shape in her mind with the particular clarity of something that is going to happen. "No," she said. "Then do it," he said again. She took a slow breath of the night air, sage and dust, and the faint coolness that comes off the mountains at night, and nodded. "All right," she said. "All right," he echoed. She leaned against him on the porch bench, her shoulder against his, looking up at the stars. He put his arm around her. They sat in the summer night on the land that was theirs, in the house they'd built, listening to the desert breathe. The sewing school, the Calloway Working School, as it became known, opened in the spring of 1887. Clara taught 2 students in the first season. A young widow from one of the ranching families who needed an income, and a woman named Petra who had come from Mexico 10 years before and who had exceptional hands and no formal instruction. Both of them, by the end of their instruction, were working and earning, which was the only metric Clara considered worth measuring. Alice took on students of her own that fall, and by 1888 there was a quiet but genuine network of women in and around Dustfield who had passed through the school and were supporting themselves, which was not, Clara understood, an achievement that anyone would put a monument to, but which was the kind of achievement that made actual differences in actual lives. James started school in 1886 and took to learning with the combination of energy and precision that was so characteristically his, exhausting his teacher on a regular basis with questions that were perfectly legitimate and relentlessly detailed. Thomas started school the following year and approached it with his characteristic methodical calm, making fewer but more considered contributions and forming, within the first month, a particular friendship with the teacher's son that would last through childhood. The ranch continued to grow in the careful, measured way that Eli managed everything, never overextending, always watching the land for what it could sustain, learning its language the way he had learned Clara's, with patience and genuine attention. By the early 1890s, it was a real and viable operation, respected by the ranching community in the territory, known for the quality of its stock and the fairness of its management. Eli, foreman no longer but proprietor, walked his land in the early mornings before the boys were up, the way he had always got the day under him before the world demanded things from it, and Clara, who sometimes watched him from the porch with her coffee, thought that he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere. Not complacently, not finished, just arrived, the way a river arrives at a valley and keeps moving but knows the shape of where it is. There was one evening in the late summer of 1891, Eli 40, Clara 36, James nearly 11, Thomas nearly 8, that stayed with Clara the way certain evenings do, unremarkable in themselves but somehow saturated with the quality of a life. They had eaten supper together, all four of them, at the kitchen table, and James had been talking about something he'd read about irrigation systems in the eastern agricultural territories, and Thomas had been quietly eating his beans and occasionally adding a very precise factual correction to James's account that James received with more grace than most 11-year-olds would. And Eli had been listening to both of them with the patient attentiveness that was so particularly his, and Clara had been watching them all. After supper, when the boys had gone to do their evening tasks, Clara stayed at the table with her coffee and Eli came and sat across from her, which he often did at this hour when the day was settling down. "Do you remember," he said, "the first time you came into the shop, the cavalry jacket?" She smiled. "You turned your hat in your hands." "I was nervous," he said. "That's a thing I've never admitted." "I know you were nervous," she said. "I noticed your hands." He looked at her. "You never said." "It seemed rude," she said, "to name a man's nervousness when he was trying so hard not to show it." He laughed, quiet and genuine. "I came in 3 more times before I let myself admit I was looking for reasons." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight with the familiar ease of someone who knows a face so well that each version of it is its own complete thing. "Clara." "Yes," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that I know how brave you were. When you came here, when you stayed." He paused. "The town made a bet about you. I said I'd prove them wrong. But I want to be clear, I didn't do anything. You proved them wrong. I just had the extraordinary privilege of watching." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the desert night was settling in, the stars beginning their vigil. "You were not nothing," she said, quietly but firmly. "You were everything. You held the space where I could be brave. That is not a small thing, Eli." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You have never once asked me to be smaller. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" He turned his hand and held hers. His face was very serious, the way it got when things mattered. "I am extraordinarily in love with you," he said, "still, as much as ever and more than when I started, which I didn't think was possible." "I know," she said. "You could say it back," he said. She smiled. "I am extraordinarily in love with you, still, more than I could have imagined when I was standing in this desert with nothing but a carpet bag and the town's low expectations." "You had your needle and thread," he said. "I had my needle and thread," she agreed. "And then I had you." He squeezed her hand. From somewhere outside came the sound of James and Thomas, the older one explaining something to the younger one adding his corrections with unruffled precision. And the sound of them, that ordinary, extraordinary sound of her children being themselves in the world she had made settled over Clara Calloway like the warmth of the stove on a cold morning. She looked at Eli. She looked at the kitchen they had built, the lamplight, the mountains beyond the window darkening against the last light of the day. She looked at the hands joined across the table between them. The town had placed its bet. It had gathered its evidence and applied its experience and concluded that a woman who had been broken would keep on breaking, that she would run because running was what she knew, that she could not stay because staying required a trust she had lost the capacity for. And they had been wrong. Not because the cowboy had rescued her. She had rescued herself, long before she met him, on a dusty road between Reno and Dustfield with a carpet bag and a decision. But because he had done something that was its own remarkable thing. He had seen her, clearly and completely, and had stayed standing in her sight, and had given her the one thing she had not been able to give herself in that first season, proof that not every hand that reaches toward you is a hand that will hurt. She had stayed. She had built. She had grown roots so deep in this desert soil that the wind couldn't find them. And the town, bless its stubborn, affectionate, limited heart, had eventually slowly, incompletely, imperfectly, come around to something approaching gratitude that she had. On a Sunday morning in early September, with the light coming golden across the land, and the mountains sharp against the blue sky, and James in the barn doing what needed doing with the unhurried competence of a boy who had grown up watching his father work with care, and Thomas in the kitchen garden, with a book propped against a tomato cage, and the house smelling of coffee and the good honest smell of a place lived in and loved. Clara stood on the east porch and watched Eli coming up from the creek pasture on horseback, his figure moving through the morning light against the green of the grass and the copper of the turning scrub oak. He saw her on the porch and raised a hand. She raised hers. He rode toward the house, unhurried, at home on the land, at home in his own life. She watched him come and she thought, "This is what I stayed for. This is what I built. This is what I am." The wind moved through the sage and the morning held them all, the land and the house and the boys and the man riding through the golden light, and Clara Holt Calloway stood on her porch in Nevada in the September of her own good life and felt, in the truest and most grounded sense of the word, home. The bet was long settled. The town had moved on to other stories, other dramas, the perpetual small business of a community that had survived its own contraction and found something worth keeping in what remained. Pete Granger, who was aging now and softer at the edges than he'd once been, had taken to stopping at the ranch on his Sunday rides and staying for coffee, a habit that had grown from Dorothy's friendship with Clara into something he'd claimed as his own. He never spoke directly about the bet. She never brought it up. But there was, in the particular quality of his visits, the way he sat at their kitchen table with his coffee cup and watched the boys with the warm, somewhat astonished air of a man confronting evidence that he had been wrong about something important. A kind of ongoing acknowledgement that satisfied Clara more than any explicit admission would have. The life continued, as lives do, not in chapters or dramatic crescendos, but in the accumulated dailiness of good work and good love, and the particular richness of a world that is truly shared. James grew toward adulthood with his inquiring mind and his mother's precision. Thomas grew toward it with his father's patient attention and a quiet warmth that was entirely his own. The school sent its graduates out into the world. The ranch sent its cattle to the market in Carson City. The mountains watched it all with their ancient, impartial blue. And Clara, who had arrived in Dustfield in the spring of 1878 with a bruised jaw and a carpet bag, and a determination that had no name, yet Clara stayed. She stayed and kept on staying, and in the staying she became something that no one who had bet against her had thought to account for, herself, entirely, without apology or diminishment, exactly as large as she had always been and finally in a world large enough to hold her. Eli Calloway had said he would spend his life proving them wrong. He had. They both had. And the life they had spent proving it was, by any measure that mattered, the finest thing either of them had ever made.